That single-dollar bill trembled between Zoe's fingers, each crease a new wound to her already exhausted spirit. The pristine banknote, deliberately crisp, deliberately singular, felt heavier than all the plates she'd carried that night. Around her, the whispers of her co-workers grew louder. They were waiting, watching for her reaction. Just moments ago, she'd served a $4,800 meal to Damian Blackwood. Not just a billionaire, but a ghost, a legend who emerged from seclusion so rarely that most believed he was a myth. He'd looked directly into her eyes, used her name, noticed her craftsmanship on the wooden carving no one else had acknowledged. Then he left her this. $1. Not an oversight. Not a mistake. A message. The humiliation burned up her neck, tightened her throat. The hope that had bloomed in her chest, that tonight might finally ease her sister's medical bills, shriveled and died, leaving only the ashen taste of disappointment. But something else stirred within her, something her father had planted years ago. "Zoe," he told her, "they can take your money, they can take your time, but never let them take your grace." In this moment, standing in Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant, holding that insulting dollar, Zoe made a choice that would echo across boardrooms and reshape futures. She reached for a pen, and with hands steadier than they had any right to be, she began to write a note on the back of his receipt. What she wrote wasn't angry. It wasn't bitter. It was something no one expected from a waitress valued at 100 cents. Something that would crack open the armor of the most powerful man in the city and expose a 30-year-old secret that connected them in ways she couldn't imagine. "I need to ask you something before I continue this story. Are you somewhere you can truly listen? Because what happens next isn't just about money or power. It's about how we choose to respond when the world tries to tell us who we are. Most people watching right now will click away. That's just statistics. But if you've ever felt unseen, undervalued, or tested beyond your limits, Zoe's response might change how you handle your own struggles. The journey we're about to take together explores what happens when grace meets guilt, when dignity confronts power, and when one person refuses to be defined by another's judgment. By the way, if you're someone who loves capturing your own personal stories, our storytelling prompt workbook could help you preserve your memories and wisdom. The link is in the pinned comment below. But right now, let's return to that moment when Zoe's dignified response set in motion events that would change everything. Sometimes, when I first heard this story, what broke me the most wasn't just Zoe's sacrifice. It was the small moments of quiet desperation that followed. Like when she'd walk past the art supply store 3 blocks from the restaurant, deliberately crossing to the other side of the street so she wouldn't have to look at the window displays. Or how she kept her acceptance letter from Pratt Institute in a drawer beside Isabella's bed. A silent promise that someday, somehow, things would be different. Sound effect. Gentle hospital beeping. Isabella noticed. Of course she did. Despite being just 17, her eyes held the ancient wisdom that comes only from facing mortality too young. At night, when Zoe thought her sister was asleep, Isabella would watch her staring at those bills, shoulders curved under invisible weight, and feel the crushing guilt of being the reason her brilliant sister was serving overpriced meals to people who barely looked at her. "You should go back," Isabella whispered one night, her voice thin from the latest round of treatments. "Apply for next semester. I can manage." But they both knew it was impossible. The insurance deductible alone was $8,000, almost exactly what Zoe had in her savings when Isabella was diagnosed. That money had disappeared in the first week. And that was before the experimental treatments their doctor said were Isabella's best hope. Sound effect. Cash register ringing. Each night at the restaurant, Zoe would watch families celebrating birthdays, couples getting engaged, executives closing deals. All those perfect moments of life happening around her while hers remained suspended. The irony wasn't lost on her. She spent her days witnessing joy she couldn't afford to feel herself. And yet, there was a small sanctuary she'd created. A corner of their tiny apartment had become her makeshift studio, just a folding table and a single shelf of supplies she couldn't bear to sell. Most nights, her exhaustion won. But sometimes, when Isabella's pain medication finally kicked in and the apartment grew quiet, Zoe would sit there for 15, maybe 20 minutes. Just touching the clay. Not even creating anymore. Just remembering what it felt like to dream. Pause for emotional impact. I share this because so many of us walk past people every day without seeing them. The person who makes your coffee, cleans your office, serves your dinner. They all have dreams deferred, promises broken, paths abandoned. How many Zoes do we pass without ever wondering what masterpieces are locked inside them? Low, intimate tone. When was the last time you truly saw someone? Not just looked at them, but really saw them. Because if this story teaches us anything, it's that sometimes a single moment of genuine seeing can change everything. And for Zoe Rodriguez, that moment was about to arrive in the most unexpected way imaginable. But first, I need to ask you to do something right now. If you know someone who's sacrificed their dreams to care for another, share this video with them. Not tomorrow. Not later. Now. Because someone watching this might be living their own version of Zoe's story, and they need to know they're not alone, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the universe has a way of recognizing invisible sacrifices. Tuesday night at the Golden Peacock. Usually quiet, predictable, but when the reservation came in under the name Mr. Stone, the entire staff felt it. The maitre d', Vincent, actually wiped sweat from his forehead, something Zoe had never seen in 3 years. "Rodriguez," he whispered, his voice tight with anxiety. "Table 12. This isn't just any customer. This is significant. Very significant. No mistakes. Don't be chatty, don't be invisible. Just be flawless." The kitchen fell silent. The cooks stopped their usual banter. Even the dishwashers slowed their rhythm. It was as if the restaurant itself was holding its breath, preparing for something momentous. When they arrived, the restaurant seemed to hold its breath. 2 men. The first was exactly what you'd expect from old money, Richard Blackstone, silver-haired, Armani suit, Rolex catching every light. He was the type who enjoyed being seen, being envied. But the second man, Conrad Ashworth, he was different. Older, maybe late 60s, with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed to catalog everything. The way Zoe walked, the slight tremor in her hand as she poured water, the worn edge of her uniform cuff. He wasn't looking at a waitress. He was studying a puzzle piece. Zoe felt it immediately. The weight of his gaze. Not lecherous or dismissive like some wealthy patrons, but calculating, measuring, as if he was solving an equation with her at the center. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "Welcome to the Golden Peacock." Blackstone barely acknowledged her, busy scanning the room to see who might recognize him. But Ashworth, his eyes never left her face. "Water with lemon for me," he said, his voice softer than she'd imagined. "And I believe my associate would like the Macallan 25. "Neat," Blackstone added, finally glancing at her. "And we'll need recommendations. Your finest recommendations." The way he said it made it clear, this wasn't about food. This was about performance. Her performance. As Zoe moved away from the table, she felt Vincent's hand on her elbow. "They requested you specifically," he whispered. "Why would Conrad Ashworth request you?" The question hung in the air. Why her? She'd never served him before. Never even seen him except in business magazines or occasional news clips. Yet here he was, in her section, watching her every move with those penetrating eyes. When she returned with their drinks, Ashworth was alone, Blackstone apparently taking a call outside. The billionaire gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit. Just for a moment." It wasn't a request staff were allowed to fulfill, but something in his voice made refusal impossible. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, no pretense, no small talk. "Yes, sir. Conrad Ashworth." "And what else?" Zoe hesitated. "You own Ashworth Industries. Telecommunications, tech investments, medical research." A small smile touched his lips. "Facts from Wikipedia. But do you know who I am?" The question felt like a test, one she couldn't possibly understand how to pass. "I'm sorry, sir. I don't understand." He studied her face for what felt like eternity. "No," he finally said. "I suppose you wouldn't. Not yet." When Blackstone returned, Ashworth transformed, becoming the affable dinner companion, discussing market trends and vacation properties as if the strange moment had never happened. But throughout the meal, Zoe caught him watching her, especially when she interacted with other tables, a family celebrating a birthday, an elderly couple who needed menu recommendations, a businessman dining alone who complained about his steak. And here's where this story takes a turn that nobody, including Zoe, could have predicted. Because Conrad Ashworth hadn't come to the Golden Peacock for dinner. He'd come for her. And the test he was about to put her through? It was designed to answer a question that had haunted him for 30 years. I need to pause here because this next part is going to challenge something most of us believe about fairness, about decency, about how the world should work. And honestly, some of you might want to click away because it gets uncomfortable watching someone be deliberately cruel to test character. But stay with me, because Zoe's response is going to redefine what you think strength looks like. Before we continue, I have to ask, have you ever been tested in a way that seemed unfair? Have you faced a moment where someone with power over your life made you feel small? This story might help you find meaning in those moments. If you're finding value in this, please hit that like button right now. It helps more people find stories that matter, stories that might change how they see the world. And subscribe if you want to join our community of people who believe in the power of human dignity. As the evening progressed, the tension in the air thickened. The other diners sensed it too. Something extraordinary was happening at table 12. The way Ashworth tracked Zoe's movements, the whispered conversations that stopped when she approached, it all built toward something inevitable. Something that would change the trajectory of multiple lives in ways no one could imagine. The meal was a dance of power and service. Richard Blackstone dominated the conversation. Acquisitions, political connections, the casual name-dropping of senators and CEOs. But Conrad Ashworth barely spoke. He ate slowly, deliberately, his dark eyes occasionally lifting to watch Zoe. Every refill, every cleared plate, every professional smile. The Golden Peacock hummed around them, other patrons casting occasional glances at the powerful men at table 12. Zoe moved with practiced precision, maintaining that delicate balance all service professionals master, being present without being intrusive, attentive without hovering. "The Barolo," Blackstone commanded, not looking up from his phone. "The 2010, not the 2012. "Of course, sir," Zoe replied, her expression never revealing that the 2010 Barolo cost more than she made in 3 days. As she returned with the wine, she caught Ashworth studying the way her hands moved. Steady, deliberate, almost artistic in their precision. Those hands that had once held paintbrushes and carving tools, before life had demanded they carry trays and polish silverware instead. And then came the moment that changed everything. As Zoe presented the dessert menu, Ashworth's voice cut through Blackstone's monologue. The pineapple carving, he said, gesturing with his fork toward an intricate wooden sculpture mounted on the wall. It's new. Zoe froze. The original had been broken a month ago by a drunk customer. The owner, Mr. Torres, had gotten a repair quote that made him wince, $3,000 to restore a decorative piece. So Zoe had done what she always did. She fixed what was broken. Late at night, after Isabella was asleep, she'd taken the splintered pieces home. Using tools she'd kept from art school, tools she thought she'd never touch again, she spent 15 hours over 2 weeks rebuilding it. Not just repairing it. Improving it. Yes, sir, she said carefully. The original was damaged. This replacement is better, Ashworth stated. Not a compliment. A fact. The proportions are more accurate. The detail work is confident. Professional level. The restaurant seemed to fall silent around them, though it hadn't. It was just that moment when your life narrows to a pinpoint, when something buried deep inside you is suddenly exposed to the light. Blackstone snorted, barely glancing at the carving. Conrad, for God's sake, it's a wooden fruit. Can we discuss the Shanghai deal? But Ashworth wasn't finished. His eyes never left Zoe's face. Who did the work? She hesitated. Only Mr. Torres knew. She hadn't wanted recognition, just to help, to save him the expense, to keep her hands busy during those sleepless nights when the hospital bills piled up on her kitchen table. I did, sir, she said finally, her voice soft but steady. Formally trained. 2 years at RISD before circumstances changed. Something flickered in Ashworth's eyes. Recognition. Understanding. She couldn't tell. The level of detail on the crown leaves, he observed. Most people wouldn't bother. Most people wouldn't even notice they were wrong on the original. But here's what gave me chills when I first heard this story. Ashworth wasn't making conversation. This was part of his evaluation. He was testing whether she would take credit, whether she would be modest or boastful, whether she would reveal the artist hidden beneath the uniform. Zoe didn't elaborate, didn't explain how she'd studied pineapple anatomy, how she'd referenced botanical drawings to get the spiral pattern exactly right, how she'd stayed up until 3 a.m. perfecting the crown when her shift started at 7. She simply nodded and moved to refill their water glasses. As she turned away, Ashworth's voice followed her. Talent finds a way to express itself, he said, more to himself than to her, even when the world conspires to bury it. If you've ever had your true self recognized by a stranger when those closest to you couldn't see it, hit that like button right now. There's something profound about being truly seen, isn't there? And if you know someone whose talents deserve recognition, share this video with them. Sometimes the stories we share become the permission others need to acknowledge their own worth. Because what Zoe didn't know, what nobody in that restaurant knew, was that she had just passed the first test. But the second test, the one coming in just minutes, it was designed to break her spirit completely. The check arrived. $4,187.50. Zoe's heart was racing. Tips from tables like this could cover Isabella's medication for a month. She placed the leather folder on the table with steady hands, her mind already calculating hope. Blackstone was already on his phone, sealing another deal. Ashworth took the check, scribbled his signature, and placed something inside. Thank you, Zoe, he said, using her name with that same deliberate precision. Excellent service. She nodded professionally and stepped away, the weight of possibility making her fingertips tingle. This was the moment every server dreamed of, the wealthy patron recognizing exceptional service. Stories circulated through restaurant staff like folklore. The hedge fund manager who left $5,000 on a $200 tab, the celebrity who paid off a server's student loans. Maybe, just maybe, this would be her miracle. Zoe waited 5 full minutes before returning to the table. Her hands were shaking, not from nerves, but from anticipation. This could change everything. This could be the miracle Isabella needed. She opened the leather folder. Written in bold, clear script, tip, $1. Total, $4,188.50. And tucked inside? A single, crisp dollar bill. So new it could have been printed that morning. The world didn't just stop. It imploded. This wasn't cheapness. Zeros can be overlooked, mistakes happen. But $1? That required thought, intention, purpose. This was a message. The humiliation was a living thing, crawling up her neck, choking her throat. Every eye in the restaurant was on her now. The legendary billionaire tip was indeed legendary, for all the wrong reasons. Ben, another server, sidled up. So, did he buy you a house? When Zoe showed him the receipt, his jaw dropped. $1? From a billionaire? That's not cheap, that's cruel. Vincent saw it next. His face hardened. You should speak to Mr. Torres. This isn't right. The kitchen staff gathered around the slip of paper as if it were evidence of a crime. The chef, usually stoic and focused, shook his head in disgust. I've worked in restaurants for 30 years. I've never seen anything so deliberately insulting. But it wasn't their humiliation to bear. It was Zoe's, and it burned like acid through the careful walls she'd built around her life. $1 wouldn't even cover Isabella's bus fare to her doctor's appointment tomorrow. $1 was what you left when you wanted someone to feel worthless. And in that moment, standing in the kitchen with the pristine bill between her fingers, Zoe felt the weight of every extra shift, every missed opportunity, every night spent carving instead of sleeping, every hope deferred for her sister's care. All of it reduced to a single, insulting dollar. She could see Ashworth and Blackstone still at the table, lingering over coffee. Blackstone laughing loudly at something on his phone. Ashworth watching, always watching, as if waiting for something. One of the busboys, Miguel, who'd been at the restaurant for decades, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. I've seen this before, he said quietly. Rich men who test people, who break them for sport. Test. Zoe whispered. To see what you're made of, Miguel said. My father worked construction for a man like this. Said he would intentionally hold pay to see which workers would fight back and which would accept mistreatment. The dollar seemed to grow heavier in her hand. This wasn't just about money. This was about dignity. About who had the right to determine another person's worth. For a fleeting moment, Zoe imagined marching back to table 12, slapping the dollar down, and telling Conrad Ashworth exactly what kind of man he was. She imagined the satisfaction in his eyes, because that's what he wanted, wasn't it? A reaction. Proof that he could break her composure, that his money gave him power over her humanity. Now, I need to be honest with you about something. Most people, when they hear this part of the story, they want revenge. They want Zoe to explode, to make a scene, to get justice. And I get it. I felt the same way. But what she did next, it's going to challenge every instinct you have about how to respond to cruelty. Are you ready for this? Because if you've ever been humiliated, if you've ever had someone with power make you feel small, what happens in the next few minutes might completely change how you handle those situations. Take a second right now to hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next in this incredible true story. And if you're already feeling something, anger, outrage, curiosity, drop a comment below with just one word that describes your emotion right now. Because hidden in that moment of humiliation was the seed of something extraordinary. Something that would not only change Zoe's life, but expose a secret that Conrad Ashworth had been carrying for 3 decades. As Zoe stood there, the dollar bill between her fingers, she made a decision that would alter the course of multiple lives. She walked back toward table 12, but not with anger or resignation. She walked with something entirely unexpected, something Conrad Ashworth, for all his billions and power, never saw coming. In that staff break room, surrounded by the smell of industrial cleaning supplies and the hum of the ice machine, Zoe held that dollar bill like it was radioactive. Every fiber of her being screamed for revenge, for justice, for some way to hurt him back. Her co-workers had already offered suggestions. Accidentally, spill water on his expensive suit. Call the local paper, Billionaire leaves insulting tip. Post it online and watch his reputation burn. The anger burned so bright it nearly blinded her. She thought of Isabella, waiting at home, surrounded by pill bottles and medical bills. She thought of the rent notice, the final warning from the electricity company, the shoes she'd been repairing instead of replacing for 2 years now. And then she heard her father's voice. David Rodriguez had been a brilliant engineer who died too young, but before he left, he'd taught her something that would save her soul. Mija, they can take your money, they can take your opportunities, but never let them take your grace. Zoe closed her eyes, remembering him, how he'd faced discrimination at work, passed over for promotions he'd earned, yet never let bitterness consume him. How he'd responded to cruelty with dignity that made his opponents seem small by comparison. "What are you going to do?" Ben asked, watching her carefully fold the dollar and place it in her pocket. Zoe walked back to the service station and asked Vincent for the customer copy of the receipt, the one Ashworth had left behind. "Why?" Vincent asked. "To frame it as a reminder of rich people's cruelty?" "No," she said, taking a pen from her apron. "To close out the check properly." What happened next, I still get chills thinking about it. Zoe smoothed that receipt on the bar, and instead of writing an angry response, instead of letting his cruelty win, she wrote something that would haunt Conrad Ashworth for the rest of his life. "Mr. Ashworth, thank you for dining with us tonight. I accept your dollar not as an insult, but as a challenge. You see, a single dollar can be the start of a fortune or the seed of kindness. Since you clearly understand building something from nothing, I'll treat this dollar with the respect it deserves. I'll invest it in a moment of kindness for someone who needs it more than I do. Perhaps a coffee for someone cold, or flowers for someone having a difficult day. Thank you for reminding me that true value isn't what's written on a check, but what we choose to do with what we're given. Sincerely, Zoe Rodriguez, Table 12. The artist who fixed the pineapple." Vincent read it over her shoulder, his expression shifting from anger to something like awe. "You're a better person than I am," he said quietly. I would have told him exactly what I thought of him. "And that's exactly what he wanted," Zoe replied, carefully folding the receipt. "He wanted to see me break. I won't give him that satisfaction." The kitchen staff gathered, passing the letter among them. The chef, a man of few words, simply nodded. "This," he said, tapping the paper, "this is courage." Miguel, the busboy who'd warned her about the test, smiled sadly. "But he will never see it. Rich men like that, they don't look back at the damage they leave behind." Zoe looked toward Table 12, where Ashworth and Blackstone were preparing to leave. "Then I'll make sure he sees it. If you're still with me, take a moment to hit that like button right now. Because what you're witnessing isn't just a story, it's a masterclass in responding to cruelty with dignity. So many of us are quick to match fire with fire, hurt with hurt. But there's a kind of power in grace that nothing can defeat. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded of their own inner strength today. The next morning, Zoe walked into a post office, clutching an envelope addressed to Conrad Ashworth's private office. Inside was her letter, along with something else, something that would ensure he couldn't ignore her message. She'd spent half the night on it, using those same artist's hands that had restored the pineapple. But Zoe wasn't done. Because what she did next was either the bravest thing you'll ever hear, or the most foolish. She was about to mail that letter directly to one of the most powerful, most private men in the world. The postal worker looked at the address and raised his eyebrows. Ashworth Tower? You sure about this? Zoe nodded, sliding the envelope across the counter. I'm sure. What she couldn't know then was that this wasn't just a letter. It was the first domino in a sequence that would unlock secrets buried for decades. Secrets about why Conrad Ashworth had really come to the Golden Peacock that night, why he'd chosen her, and what he was really looking for. The next morning, Zoe woke before her alarm. The first thing she did was take that crisp dollar from her uniform pocket. At the corner bodega, she bought a stamp and an envelope. With the change, 67 cents, she bought a small coffee. It wasn't much. Not compared to the $4,000 dinner Ashworth and Blackstone had consumed without a second thought. But in her hands, that 67 cents felt weightier than all their wealth, because it carried intention, carried purpose. Walking to the post office, she saw him, an elderly man huddled in a doorway, his breath visible in the cold morning air. His eyes held the exhausted resignation of someone who'd been invisible to the world for too long. Zoe walked over and extended the coffee. This is for you. The man looked up, surprised. His calloused hands wrapped around the warm cup like it was a treasure. God bless you, miss. God bless you. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Two humans connecting in a world that often rushed past such moments. The man took a sip, closing his eyes briefly at the simple pleasure of warmth. My name's Harold, he said, as if offering the only thing he had left to give, his identity. I'm Zoe, she replied, crouching down beside him. It's not much, just coffee. Harold shook his head slowly. It's not the coffee, miss. It's being seen. Some days nobody looks at me at all. In that moment, Conrad Ashworth's cruel dollar had already accomplished more kindness than most people's generous tips. Zoe had transformed an insult into an act of love. As she continued to the post office, Zoe felt lighter somehow. The humiliation of the previous night hadn't disappeared, but it had been transformed, reframed. What had been meant to diminish her had instead revealed her strength. At the post office, she addressed the envelope to Ashworth Tower, Park Avenue. Her hand hovered over the mail slot for what felt like forever. This was the point of no return. She could lose her job. She could be blacklisted. She could become the cautionary tale every server whispered about. But she thought about her father's words, never let them take your grace. She thought about Isabella, who fought through pain every day without complaint. She thought about Harold, grateful for a simple moment of human connection. She let it go. The letter dropped into the slot with a finality that sent a shiver down her spine. Done. No turning back. On her way to the hospital to visit Isabella before her shift, Zoe passed a small flower stand. With the remaining few cents in her pocket, literally pennies, she asked the vendor what she could buy. The woman studied her for a moment, then handed her a single daisy. On the house, she said, waving away Zoe's protest. You look like someone who could use a little brightness today. Zoe stared at the flower, unexpected tears stinging her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. Later, as Isabella held the daisy in her thin fingers, her smile illuminated the sterile hospital room. It's perfect, she said. Tell me something good that happened yesterday. Zoe hesitated. Should she tell her sister about the humiliation? About the billionaire and his insulting dollar? About the letter she'd just mailed that might cost her everything? Instead, she said, I met someone named Harold today, and I realized something Dad always said was true, that kindness multiplies. If you're watching this and thinking about a time when someone's cruelty gave you an opportunity to show who you really are, I want you to hit that like button right now. And if you haven't experienced that yet, subscribe, because life will test all of us eventually. The question isn't if we'll face cruelty, it's who we'll choose to be when we do. Now, here's what I need you to understand about this moment, and this might make you uncomfortable. Most of us, when we're tested like this, we fail. We choose anger over grace. We choose revenge over character. We choose the easy response over the right one. But Zoe, she chose differently. And that choice was about to unlock a secret that would change not just her life, but reveal the truth about her father's legacy. 3 days passed. Zoe returned to work at the Golden Peacock. The incident became restaurant legend. Servers would point to table 12 and whisper about the billionaire and the dollar. But Zoe refused to be defined by that moment. She served with the same care, the same attention to detail, the same grace she always had. Until the morning Vincent called her, his voice tense with urgency. Zoe, there's someone here asking for you. Someone important. Who? She asked, already running late for her shift. The pause on the other end of the line seemed to stretch forever. Conrad Ashworth's personal assistant. And Zoe. She's carrying a package with your name on it. Days turned into weeks. Every phone call made Zoe's heart jump. Every time Vincent looked at her, she expected him to say, "You're fired." But there was only silence. Deafening, absolute silence from Park Avenue. Each morning, she checked her mailbox with diminishing hope. Each afternoon, she scanned the restaurant entrance, half expecting to see Ashworth's towering figure. Each night, she lay awake wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. You did the right thing, Isabella assured her from the hospital bed where she spent 3 days that week for treatment. No matter what happens. But what was happening? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Isabella had a rough week. New medication, new bills. The credit card statement arrived like a monthly funeral notice. The brief spark of defiance Zoe had felt was suffocating under the weight of reality. At work, the story had already become distorted. I heard she told him off, a new busboy whispered. I heard she threatened to expose him, countered a hostess. The truth, her quiet dignity, her transformative grace, was less exciting than the fiction people preferred. On Thursday, Mr. Torres called her into his office. Zoe's stomach plummeted as she sat across from him, hands folded tightly in her lap. Is everything all right? He asked, his brow furrowed with concern. You seem distracted lately. I'm fine, she lied. Just tired. He studied her face. You know, Vincent told me what happened with Ashworth. Her throat tightened. I understand if you need to let me go. I shouldn't have let you go. Mr. Torres looked genuinely confused. Why would I do that? What you did took courage. The kind of courage I wish I had more of myself. Relief flooded through her, but it was short-lived. Because while her job was secure, nothing else was. Isabella's treatments were becoming more frequent, more expensive. The apartment needed repairs she couldn't afford. Her father's watch, the last thing he'd given her, needed a new crystal she had to put off replacing. Maybe it had been foolish. Maybe she'd thrown her message in a bottle into an ocean too vast to matter. Maybe she was just a waitress, and that's all she'd ever be. On Saturday night, she found herself serving table 12 again. A young couple celebrating an engagement. They were kind, grateful, and left a generous tip. But as she cleared their dishes, Zoe couldn't help glancing at the door, couldn't stop the foolish hope that had somehow survived 2 weeks of silence. But 70 floors above Park Avenue, in an office that was more temple than workspace, Conrad Ashworth sat behind a desk carved from a single piece of reclaimed oak. The room was silent except for the hum of the city below. On his otherwise empty desk sat a small, cream-colored envelope. He'd read Zoe's letter 3 times now. Not once. Not twice. 3 times. And beside the letter lay something else. The thing she'd included that ensured he couldn't ignore her message. A small, delicately carved wooden dollar bill. Perfect in every detail, from Washington's portrait to the serial number, which wasn't random. It was the date her father died. Because in his world of calculated responses and predictable human behavior, this was impossible. He'd designed the dollar test to provoke anger, tears, complaints. He'd expected a typical reaction to cruel manipulation. He had not expected grace. He had not expected charity. He had not expected her to take his cynical gesture and transform it into an act of love. His assistant knocked softly. "Sir, the car is waiting, and Ms. Chen from legal has been holding for 20 minutes. Ashworth nodded, but didn't move. "Tell me something, Rebecca. Do you believe people can change? Truly change?" Rebecca, who'd been with him for 18 years, looked startled by the personal question. I believe it's possible. Difficult, but possible. Even after decades of being a certain way. Even after building an entire life on a foundation that might be wrong. If you're starting to feel the weight of this moment, hit that like button. Because we've all faced crossroads where we had to decide, do we continue down the path we've always known, or do we find the courage to change direction? Your like reminds others they're not alone in these moments of truth. But here's what Zoe didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that her father's name was carved into the foundation of Conrad Ashworth's empire. And the guilt over that had been eating him alive for 30 years. David Rodriguez. The brilliant engineer who'd died too young. The man who'd taught Zoe about grace. The creator of the algorithm that had made Ashworth his first billion. An algorithm he'd acquired through methods that haunted his dreams. Ashworth reached for the intercom. "Rebecca, cancel my meetings for the afternoon. And call the car. I need to go to the Golden Peacock." But just as his finger touched the button, his phone rang. It was the hospital. There had been a complication with Isabella Rodriguez. Critical condition. And they couldn't reach her sister. The Golden Peacock was unusually quiet that evening when the sleek black Maybach pulled up to the curb. Vincent nearly dropped a tray of drinks when a woman in an impeccable charcoal suit walked in, scanning the restaurant with the focus of a hunter. "I'm looking for Zoe Rodriguez," she announced, her voice soft but commanding. "She's not here," Vincent replied, a protective edge in his tone. "Family emergency." The woman nodded as if this confirmed something. "My name is Evelyn Reed, Chief of Staff for Conrad Ashworth. Where can I find her?" Vincent hesitated, loyalty warring with intimidation. Memorial Hospital. Her sister. But Evelyn was already turning, speaking urgently into her phone. Meanwhile, in a sterile hospital corridor, Zoe sat with her head in her hands. The doctors had been blunt. Isabella needed an experimental treatment. One not covered by insurance. One that cost more than Zoe would make in 5 years. There must be something, she'd pleaded. A program, a study, anything. The specialist had looked at her with practiced sympathy. There are waiting lists, but realistically, without immediate intervention. He didn't need to finish. Zoe understood time was the one thing Isabella didn't have. She reached into her pocket, touching the worn wood of her father's pocket watch. It was the only thing of value she owned. It wouldn't be nearly enough, but it was something. Maybe she could sell it, find loans, beg Mr. Torres for an advance. Ms. Rodriguez. Zoe looked up to see a woman she'd never met, flanked by what could only be security personnel. I'm Evelyn Reed. Mr. Ashworth sent me. The corridor seemed to narrow, the fluorescent lights suddenly too bright. If this is about my letter, this isn't the time. This is precisely about your letter, Evelyn interrupted. And about your father, David Rodriguez. The name hung in the air like a physical presence. My father? What does my father have to do with Conrad Ashworth? Evelyn gestured to a private waiting area. Everything. He has everything to do with Conrad Ashworth. Inside that small room, Zoe learned the truth that had been buried for 30 years. How her father, a brilliant systems engineer, had developed an algorithm that revolutionized telecommunications routing. How he'd pitched it to a young Conrad Ashworth and his then partner, Gregory Thorne. How a deal had been struck. And how, 3 weeks later, David Rodriguez died in what was ruled an accident. 2 months after that, Ashworth Communications launched with a groundbreaking algorithm, the same one her father had created. My father was murdered? Zoe whispered, the world tilting beneath her. Mr. Ashworth doesn't know, Evelyn said carefully. He believed Mr. Thorne had legally acquired the algorithm after your father's death. It wasn't until he received your letter, with the wooden carving bearing your father's date of death, that he began to investigate. The wooden dollar. The signature she'd carved into it. The date she'd chosen not randomly, but because it was etched into her heart. Your craftsmanship, Evelyn continued. Your name. Your integrity. They reminded him of someone he'd met briefly 30 years ago. A young engineer with the same hands, the same principles. I need to pause here because what happens next is something we rarely get to witness. The moment when decades of injustice finally face the light of truth. If you've ever wondered if the wrongs of the past can ever be made right, stay with this story. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what comes next, because this confrontation will change how you think about power, about justice, and about redemption. Before Zoe could process this revelation, the door opened again. Conrad Ashworth himself stood there, his imposing figure somehow diminished by the weight of what he'd discovered. Ms. Rodriguez, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I owe you more than an apology. I owe you the truth. That truth led them across the city to the penthouse offices of Thorne Enterprises. Gregory Thorne, silver-haired, tanned, powerful, looked up from his desk with annoyance that quickly shifted to shock when he saw who had entered. Conrad. Then his eyes found Zoe, and something like fear flickered across his face. What is this about? David Rodriguez, Ashworth said, placing a file on Thorne's desk. The algorithm. The accident that wasn't an accident. Thorne's face hardened. Ancient history. Unprovable accusations. Is this really worth risking everything we've built? Worth risking. Zoe stepped forward, her voice steady despite her racing heart. My father died. My sister is dying. While you've lived in penthouses built on his genius. What unfolded was a confession decades in the making. How Thorne had arranged everything. The theft, the cover-up, the accident. How Ashworth had built an empire on stolen brilliance, never knowing the blood price that had been paid. I can't undo what was done, Ashworth said, turning to Zoe. But I can try to make it right. By midnight, Isabella had been moved to a private room in the hospital's VIP wing. The experimental treatment was scheduled for the following day, all expenses covered. But more than that, a trust was being established. The Rodriguez Algorithm Trust, ensuring that David's name would finally be associated with his creation, and that his daughters would receive the legacy that had been stolen from them. If you believe in justice, even justice delayed, take a moment to share this video. Because in a world where the powerful so often escape consequences, stories like this remind us that truth has a way of surfacing, that integrity has power that money can't buy. As Zoe sat beside her sleeping sister, holding her hand, she thought about the journey that had led here. A dollar bill meant to humiliate. A letter written with dignity instead of rage. A wooden carving that connected past to present. You were right, Dad, she whispered. They can take your money, your opportunities. They can even take your life. But they can never take your grace. And sometimes, grace is the most powerful weapon of all. 6 months later, Zoe stood at the edge of a cliff overlooking the Hudson River. The glass house before her caught the morning light, fracturing it into 1,000 rainbows across the polished concrete floor. She took a deep breath, steadying herself against the reality that all of this, was now part of her life. The glass house perched on the Hudson River cliff wasn't just a home, it was a temple to possibility. And when Zoe walked into that sculpture studio, with its soaring ceilings and river view, she didn't just see an art space. She saw her soul coming back to life. This isn't charity, Conrad said, his voice heavy with 3 decades of regret. This is restoration. I stole your father's legacy, and in doing so, I stole your time, your focus, your chance to create. I'm giving it back. Isabella, healthier now after 3 rounds of the experimental treatment, ran her fingers over the tools arranged on the workspace. Dad would have loved this, she whispered. Conrad nodded, the weight of the past visible in the new lines on his face. In the months since that night at the hospital, he'd aged somehow, not physically, but in his eyes. The burden of knowledge, of complicity, had transformed him. Gregory Thorne was facing charges now. The accident that had claimed David Rodriguez's life had been reopened as a potential homicide. Justice was slow, but it was coming. The first exhibition opens next month, Conrad said, gesturing to the wall where Zoe's pieces would soon hang. We've already had inquiries from 3 major galleries. The David Rodriguez Foundation for Emerging Artists. $500 million dedicated to finding and supporting artists who'd faced impossible choices. And Zoe wouldn't just be the first recipient, she'd help choose who came after. But here's what broke me when I first heard this part. It wasn't the money that made Zoe cry. It wasn't the studio or the foundation or the promise of Isabella's care. It was the moment she picked up that sculpting tool and realized she was still an artist. That 3 years of serving tables hadn't killed the creator in her soul. That moment came when Conrad left them alone in the studio. When Zoe stood before a block of wood and felt something awaken that had been dormant for too long. Her first piece was already taking shape by sunset, not a pineapple this time, but something more profound. A hand, outstretched, offering a single carved dollar bill. The universal gesture of both humiliation and, ultimately, redemption. Isabella watched her work through the evening, the old rhythm returning to Zoe's movements, the certainty in her hands. You never lost it, she said softly. I thought I had, Zoe replied, stepping back to study the emerging form. I thought that part of me was gone forever. The weight was gone. Not just the financial pressure, but the crushing certainty that she'd forever traded her dreams for duty. In choosing grace over revenge, dignity over anger, she hadn't just passed a test, she'd unlocked a destiny. 2 weeks later, Conrad Ashworth visited the Golden Peacock one last time. Not as a customer, but as a messenger. He placed an envelope on the bar where Vincent and Mr. Torres stood watching him warily. "For the staff," he said simply. "A small token of appreciation for their loyalty to one of your employees." Inside was enough to renovate the entire restaurant, with bonuses for every person who'd supported Zoe during those difficult years. "Why are you doing all this?" Mr. Torres asked, bewildered by the generosity. Conrad's answer was simple. "Because someone once taught me that true value isn't what's written on a check, but what we choose to do with what we're given." If you've made it this far in the story, I want you to pause for a moment. Think about how easy it would have been for Zoe to choose differently, to react with anger, to seek revenge, to let bitterness consume her. Hit that like button if you believe her choice to respond with grace was the true source of her power. Now, I need to be completely honest with you about why I told you this story. It's not just because it's inspiring, though it absolutely is. It's because most of us will never face a test this dramatic. We won't have billionaires leaving us insulting tips or mysterious foundations appearing in our lives. But we will have moments, maybe this week, maybe today, where someone tests our character. Where someone is cruel to us, dismisses us, treats us as less than we are. And in that moment, we'll have the same choice Zoe had: respond with anger or grace, revenge or character, bitterness or love. The truth is, most people will choose anger. Most people will let cruelty turn them cruel. Most people will let other people's darkness snuff out their light. But you're not most people, are you? You wouldn't have watched this far if you were. Because I've got 7 more stories just like this one. Stories of ordinary people who faced extraordinary tests of character and chose the path that seemed impossible. Stories that will challenge how you see strength, success, and what it really means to win in life. If Zoe's story moved something in you, if it made you think about how you respond when life tests you, then I need you to do 2 things. First, hit that subscribe button, because I promise you, and I don't make promises lightly, every story I share will challenge you to be better than you thought possible. And second, share this with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who's been knocked down, dismissed, or told they don't matter. Because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is remind someone else that their character is more valuable than their circumstances. Tell me in the comments, what's the most graceful response to cruelty you've ever witnessed? Have you ever seen someone choose love when they had every right to choose hate? Because after hearing Zoe's story, I believe those moments might be the most important ones we ever witness. And if you want to develop the kind of character that turns tests into triumphs, I've created something that might help. It's a workbook of storytelling prompts designed to help you find the hero in your own story, even when life feels like the villain. The link is in the description, but honestly, the real treasure isn't in any workbook. It's in the choice you make the next time someone tries to diminish your worth. Choose grace. Choose character. Choose to be like Zoe.